So for this last part about Leibniz, what we really need to think about is Leibniz's philosophy of mind. And in order to do this, we're going to again try to contrast him with Descartes and Spinoza. And if you want more details about this, I actually just uploaded in the supplemental readings folder under course information some additional Leibniz material. And it obviously, you're not in any way obligated to read it. None of the exam material will be specifically about any of this stuff, but it can really help you get a sense for how Leibniz is different than Descartes and Spinoza. One of them is sort of just a commentary on a running commentary on Spinoza, which I think would be very interesting for all of us, as people who have just gone through the ethics. But he also has a letter about Descartes and Cartesianism and his long-standing disagreements with Descartes. And so reading this material can help sort of further sharpen the contrast between these three big rationalist figures. Now, to understand Leibniz's philosophy of mind, so how he thinks about, how the mind and the body interact, or if they do interact, it's important to contrast him with Descartes and Spinoza. So Descartes, as we all know, was an interactionist, which meant that he held that there were two fundamentally different kinds of substances. There's mental substances, which are not extended in space, and there are bodies, which are extended substances in space. And certain bodies have minds within them. They have a pineal gland, and in that the mind and the brain communicate with one another, and this is the explanation behind the passions and voluntary actions. So there's influence that goes in both directions, from the mind to the brain and from the brain to the mind. Now, Spinoza's view, which we can call dual aspect monism, is called that because there's one single thing, namely God, that we're examining. And so that's the monism, is that there's one substance. However, that substance appears under two different attributes, appears in two ways, from the order of thought and from the order of extension. And so this is similar to Descartes in that he also believes that extension and thought are essentially distinct from one another. But unlike Descartes, he does not think that these are separable. These are two different perspectives on the same thing, namely God. And so this is why it's not a mystery why it is that the things that we think roughly correspond to the nature of the world and vice versa. And where they don't, in the case of optical illusions and the like, we have the ability to discover why that's the case. Now, so for Leibniz, you can really see how many of his objections to Descartes and Spinoza are going to come from their understandings of God. So Leibniz shares with Spinoza this question for Descartes, which is that if bodies and minds are essentially distinct from one another, they hold no properties in common, how is it that they could ever possibly interact with each other? Leibniz agrees with Spinoza's criticism of Descartes on this point. However, Leibniz thinks that this also applies to Spinoza. Namely, if extension and thought are essentially distinct, how is it possible that there are two different perspectives on the same thing? Isn't it just an enormous coincidence, at least in Spinoza's philosophical system, that there are exactly two attributes, and that the order of one attribute exactly corresponds to the order of the other attributes, if they're fundamentally distinct, then it is a mystery how they can be about the same thing. So Leibniz, his way of solving the mind-body problem is through his conception of God. And this might seem in many ways reminiscent of perhaps some of the elements of Descartes' meditations that we were the most skeptical of. For Leibniz, what ensures that there is a correspondence between bodies and minds is that there's a pre-established harmony instituted by God. Now, so this might sound very similar to Spinoza's point of view, and that's because in many ways it is. However, for Spinoza, God is not a person, right? God doesn't make decisions. God doesn't try to create the best of all possible worlds. God isn't looking out for any of his creation or anything like that, right? And so that's ultimately why Leibniz finds dual aspect monism so suspicious, is that if God were a person and God made decrees and God acted for reasons, then we could understand why it is that God would sort of order the universe, as in the case of like an extremely intricate watch, right? In an extremely or in an intricately crafted watch, you know, there are minute interactions that are so complex that are difficult for us to understand without the engineer's perspective. And for Leibniz, the creation of God is infinitely more complex than the creation of human beings. And so his example is just that biological creatures are infinitely more complex than human artifacts. Why is that the case? Well, because living creatures, are composed themselves of further living creatures. And Leibniz actually met the person that discovered the existence of microorganisms. But this is an important part of Leibniz's theory of the monad, is that the monad sort of expresses the whole world, and so you can expect to find within monads other monads, but they're just seen from a certain perspective. So for one thing, for example, it's one thing to see, for example, a cell in my body from my perspective, where I see it as just, you know, like kind of a part of me, and even a non-essential part, one that could go away. You know, it could die to like bacteria or a virus or something like that if it's a white blood cell. And I would remain the same. I have other blood cells, right? And they die over time while I retain my identity. And so one way to see that monad is, you know, or that living creature is from my point of view, right? But another way to see it would be like, for example, from the perspective of a virus or a bacteria, right? And these would express very different dimensions of that same thing, right? But it's interesting because they cohere with one another, right? My own perspective on that white blood cell coheres in some way with the perspective offered to it by, you know, its own rival microorganism or whatever, right? Different aspects of it are salient, but it's not like my understanding of that monad is radically different than some other monads, right? We just see it from two different points of view. And so for Leibniz, the pre-established harmony of thought and extension occurs mainly because God ordered the universe in a way that Leibniz would describe as the best way of ordering the universe. God structures the universe to operate according to the best possible reasons. And so those are going to cohere or be the same across monads. And this is why there's only one world that's expressed by all of the monads, is because those worlds are, the technical term is compossible. They can be together, right? They don't contradict one another, or the technical terminology would be to run into an incompossibility, so that the world as expressed by one monad would be incompatible with the world as expressed by another monad. And this is really what Leibniz thinks that we're afraid of whenever we're worried about the mind-body problem, is that it seems like there are different aspects of reality that don't make sense together. And for Leibniz, this is in fact the case, that unless you make reference to God and make reference to the fact that God would structure the universe in a basically rational fashion, that you would have no reason for thinking that the perspectives offered in various dimensions of the world ultimately cohere with one another. But insofar as you believe in his conception of God, then you do have an adequate explanation for why the same world can be expressed through multiple different perspectives that seem like they are different. Is because ultimately they converge on the very same world that is established by God. I hope that's helpful to you. It's some very difficult material, but I hope that it spurs reflection. Even if ultimately you end up disagreeing with Leibniz, it can be very difficult to try to answer some of the objections that he makes to Spinoza and Descartes, which ultimately amount to the fact that they don't have a real explanation for why you would expect a convergence between multiple different, apparently essentially opposed points of view. And Leibniz thinks that his own conception of God and the pre-established harmony can do just that.